our congressional coverage. And Megyn, in the aftermath of the criticism, backlash perhaps from some of his Republican colleagues, Chuck Schumer did post on X this afternoon that the U.S. cannot dictate the outcome of an election, going on to say the important thing is that Israelis are given a choice. How significant is it that Chuck Schumer was brought to this moment?
It definitely felt like he had reached a breaking point with Israel and with Netanyahu in particular. And as we said at the start of the show, he is the highest ranking elected official in the U.S. government. So that just really underscores this. And then at the same time that this was playing out, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Herzog, was actually having lunch with Republicans who were on a retreat in West Virginia. So it just really brought to the forefront where the two parties are in the ongoing Israeli-Gaza conflict. And Democrats have trended more and more critical of Israel, while Republicans have, by and large, stood by Netanyahu.
And of course, in the Senate, already they have passed a bill that would provide funding not just to Israel, but Ukraine and Taiwan as well, whereas the House, it's unclear if that's ever going to pass in that chamber. What did pass in the House, though, just yesterday was the TikTok bill. Yes. Divest or ban, to sum it up. Huge bipartisan margin got that across the finish line in the House. What's going to happen in the Senate, though? Do we have any real idea of how this is going to go at this point?
So what we're hearing today is that they're going to go through regular order in the Senate, which means it goes to committee, where it is open to amendments. There are concerns about the time frame, for instance, of the divestiture. Should ByteDance decide to divest itself of TikTok? I think it's a 6-month time frame in the House bill. And even supporters in the Senate are saying that's too short of a time window, and they want to open it up to other amendments as well. Then it could be amended again on the floor. Now, the Senate is coming up on a 2-week recess, and then we really get into the throes of the election season, where policymaking essentially grounds to a halt in Washington, and lawmakers are eager to be back home campaigning. So making it go through this committee process could essentially just stop it for the year, in which case it would need to be started all over again in a new Congress in January.
All right, Bloomberg's Megyn Scully, thank you so much. Of course, another key story we are following today relates to former President Donald Trump. His first criminal trial may not begin on March 25th as planned, after lawyers for the Manhattan District Attorney and former President Trump told a judge they received tens of thousands of new pages of evidence from government prosecutors. DA Alvin Bragg's office said Thursday that some 31,000 pages of records were turned over to their office on Wednesday, adding they would not object to a 30-day delay in the start of Trump's hush money trial. Trump, meanwhile, has asked the judge presiding over the case for a 90-day delay. Elsewhere, fresh data on inflation and unemployment filings giving the Fed more reasons to hold off on cutting interest rates. So how should we be reading this economic data we got this morning? Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Enda Curran. So Enda, you have inflation hot, you have a labor market still hanging in there, and you have a Fed meeting come Wednesday. How much more complicated do these figures make the job of Jerome Powell and the rest of the FOMC?
It's getting complicated. Today we had producer prices coming in at a 6-month high, plus 1.6%, due to food and fuel costs. And that means if wholesale prices are still staying pretty high, the concern is that downstream consumer prices will remain pretty high. We did have inflation data only a few days ago, also reaffirming that prices that we're paying for goods like airline tickets and car insurance are still high. And as you say, the net takeaway is inflation is not necessarily playing a script at the moment. We're in March now. It's expected to be slower than it is. We do have a Fed meeting next week, and by all accounts, most people are saying the takeaway will be cuts are still on the horizon, but those cuts might now take longer to come through than initially thought.
Yeah, maybe we'll be pushing those even further back into this election year. Speaking of the fact that this being an election year and economic considerations factoring into this, President Biden, within the last 24 hours, has put out a statement opposing the U.S. steel deal, this more than $14 billion deal that would see it taken over by Nippon, a Japanese company, essentially saying it needs to stay in U.S. hands and that he has the backs of U.S. steel workers. Is concern around this deal really about national security, hence the CFIUS review, or is it about economics and politics more than anything else?
Yeah, I think politics is the main factor at play here. If you leave aside the merits of the deal one way or another, this is about an iconic US company. It's about steel. It's about the US administration trying to promote the revival of manufacturing. It's in a key swing state. It's the president's state. I mean, there's a lot of political points stacking up here. And I think observers looking at this are kind of putting the economics on one side and saying, well, this deal came in the middle of a hot election political year, and that's probably what's going on. But to your point, we still have the official review, the Treasury review of foreign investment. That's still going on. We don't know what decision they will come to. But it's a pretty unusual intervention by the president. It probably puts a fair shadow over this deal. And I think a lot of people are saying politics is the bigger factor here than economics.
All right, Bloomberg's Enda Curran, thank you so much, as always, for joining us. Now, coming up next on Balance of Power, Democratic Senator Mark Warner, the chair of the Select Committee on Intelligence, will be with us to talk about U.S. Steel, but also TikTok and much more. That's next right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We have committed that we will continue to do so. We will continue to do all we can, including exercising our legal rights.
The wildly popular social media app in the U.S. or face a ban in app stores. That legislation, though, now facing an unclear future in the Senate. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the chair of the Select Committee on Intelligence, supports the bill and is joining me now. Senator, thank you so much for coming back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It seems there's more talk in the Senate now of this going through regular order. Do you support that, or will regular order kill this effort?
Well, let's first of all remember why this is important. And I've been on this issue for over a year, and with all due respect to the TikTok management, when I had a bipartisan bill, they made incredible number of false claims about the bill. They tried to make the same false claims about the effort in the House. And frankly, their heavy-handed tactics totally backfired. They got 352 members of the House of Representatives to vote for a divestiture of TikTok. I don't want TikTok to go away. I agree there's a lot of creativity. But I don't want at the end of the day the Chinese Communist Party, because Chinese law as of 2017 says every company has to be first and foremost not loyal to customers or shareholders, but to the Communist Party. And they pose a national security risk for two reasons. One, they're collecting an enormous amount of personal data about Americans. The genius of TikTok, it kind of knows what you like even before you may know. And that kind of personal data, the 170 million Americans who are on 90 minutes a day, if you don't think that is a security risk, or potentially you could be blackmailed at some future time by agents of the Chinese government, then I think you don't understand the unfortunate real world that we live in. So data protection is key. The other half of this is the ability for TikTok to slightly shift that algorithm and affect the news. I mean, half of the young people on TikTok get almost all their news from TikTok. So it would not surprise me at all if the Communist Party says, as it gets closer to election in America, if there's not a disgorgement, hey, China ought to be able to take over Taiwan with no problem. Or Vladimir Putin, we ought to give him Ukraine. Completely anti-American interest, driven by frankly, a country's leadership who is clearly viewed and is an adversary of the United States. We would never allow a Chinese company to come in and buy Bloomberg, buy Fox, buy MSNBC, and then produce news for America. We'd say that's crazy. Well, that's unfortunately what's happening now.
Okay, so Senators, clearly you see great risk with the operation of this platform and the ownership of ByteDance, considering the China factor here. Given that, do you think that this deserves to be expedited, to not go through regular order? Is that how you would like to see this approached in your chamber?
I absolutely would like to see it expedited. And, I've started conversations with the chairman of the Commerce Committee, Senator Cantwell, and again, she doesn't need convincing. She has legislation as well on this topic. I know, Senator Schumer, this all just happened yesterday, so Senator Schumer's not laid out clearly all his plans, but, I know he's raised concerns as well. So I think we need to get this done. And what, again, we need to make clear is nobody's talking about a ban. We're talking about transferring the ownership and the algorithm to some other control that's not Chinese.
Well, and doing so in a relatively short period of time, Senator, the time frame is 6 months. Do you realistically think not only a buyer can be found, but a deal be completed and China sign off on it in that amount of time?
Well, that's one of the areas that might need a little more stretch. But we've already seen in the news today, I think you guys have been reporting, that former Trump Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, who was frankly one of the first people that educate me about this issue, is trying to put together an investor group to buy ByteDance/TikTok. I think there will be others. I think, the question will be, will the Chinese government allow it to be sold, because they would lose this data collection tool and this propaganda tool that I think is for their purposes, even more valuable than the value of the company.
And of course, a lot of this does come down to national security considerations. And it seems, sir, that a lot is coming down to national security considerations these days, including potentially U.S. Steel being bought by a Japanese company, Japan, a very close ally to the United States. And yes, CFIUS is looking into this deal. President Biden now put out a statement suggesting that U.S. Steel should stay in American hands. But, sir, is that really about national security, or is it just the fact that it's an election year and there's politics at play?
Listen, I think there is a difference between nations like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea that are in our law defined as adversaries, and countries like Japan that, as you said, is a close ally. I haven't followed all the ins and outs, but I understood that the Nippon Steel that was going to try to acquire U.S. Steel was going to guarantee American jobs, guarantee the labor contracts. But I've not really dug into this at the level to offer a full-fledged opinion. I do think, though, I believe that in a trading environment where we ought to do business with our friends and allies around the world.
Okay, well, I'd like to ask you, sir, about another ally, Israel. Your majority leader, Chuck Schumer, on the floor today suggested that there needs to be a new election in Israel, that perhaps Netanyahu should no longer be in the job that he is in. Is it appropriate for one of the highest-ranking members of the U.S. government to be making such suggestions about a Democratic ally?
Well, first of all, I've been a lifelong supporter of Israel. But I worry. I worry the way Prime Minister Netanyahu is conducting this war with 30,000 now dead Palestinians, with inability to get humanitarian aid into Gaza, with, frankly, some of the settler violence in the West Bank, that we could be losing a generation, particularly of young Americans, who are never going to be supportive of Israel. And I don't think that's in Israel's long-term interest. I'm not going to tell Israel who they should have as leader, but I would point out Prime Minister Netanyahu was never shy about interfering in American politics. If you remember how he at every turn tried to thwart President Obama when he was president, and if you've seen the way he is, even since October 7th, particularly treated our Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, it's not been the way a treatment would be of a country like Israel's strongest, most fervent, and frankly, at this point, maybe sole remaining major ally in the world.
President Biden in recent days had suggested in an interview that if Israel were to proceed with an invasion of Rafah, that could potentially cross a red line. What consequence, what recourse would the United States have if Israel were to go ahead and conduct that operation despite warnings from this administration?
Well, first of all, the United States and Bill Burns, the CIA director, has been absolutely leading the effort to try to get the hostages released and a ceasefire, a pause. And that's what we ought to be aiming for. And I think much of the Israeli government supports that. The idea that you're going to go into this community of 1.5 million people now, where people have been literally bunched together with no ability for those Palestinians to have any kind of safety. You could have this conflict that's just been in Gaza spread to Lebanon, spread to Jordan, spread to the West Bank. That's not in America's interest. I don't even think it's obviously not in Israel's interest, because if the United States ends up saying we are going to restrict some of our aid because you have taken this very aggressive action and suddenly Israel's fighting on a multi-front war, I think that would be a disaster for Israel.
And finally, Senator, I'd like to ask you specifically about aid to another U.S. ally, Ukraine. Just in the last several days here at Bloomberg, we've spoken with the Prime Minister of Latvia, with the President of Poland, both of which expressed real dire consequence if Ukraine does not get the support it needs and potentially loses the war to Russia. House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCaul said today he's working on a path forward for that aid in the House. He said one way to pay for it that's increasingly popular among Republicans is seizing hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign Russian assets to pay for it. If it gets the aid to Ukraine, Senator, would you support that effort?
You guys are Bloomberg News. You know that even if we were to pass a law and the vast majority of this Russian assets are in Europe, it will take years of litigation. Anybody that says that's going to get them the $60 billion they need yesterday, and I think Mike McCaul understands that, that could be part of a process, but that is not going to relieve the need. And I can't think of an issue that is of more historic proportions than supporting the Ukrainians at this moment. The Ukrainians, with a little bit of help from us, less than 3% of our defense budget 2 years running, have destroyed 87% of Russia's pre-existing ground forces, 63% of their tanks, 32% of their armored personnel carriers, without the loss of a single American life. What the folks you had from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland on, if Putin wins in Ukraine, they will be next. And American soldiers could be in harm's way and in conflict within a couple of years. That would be a disaster. And it would be a disaster that would be laid at the feet of this Speaker of the House, who hasn't brought this bill up. There are 300 votes plus for Ukraine in the House. Let the House express its will. There are 70 votes in the Senate. If we walk away from this obligation, I think most countries will never trust us again. And that will be a mistake of historic proportions. Those who make comparisons to what happened with appeasement before World War II in terms of Hitler are not far off from this level of importance of this decision.
All right, Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, the chair of the Intelligence Committee, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up, we'll go from Capitol Hill to the White House. Jared Bernstein, chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, will join us next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
If you take a step back, our progress on inflation does continue down from a peak of 9% to the 3% range. Always, I think we've expected some seasonality in January and February. We didn't expect the progress to continue on a straight line. But I think if you look at what we have from CPI and PPI, and now looking ahead to core PCE for the month of February, expect some continued progress there on that core annual inflation number.
That was Daniel Hornung, National Economic Council Deputy Director, speaking earlier today on Bloomberg as producer prices came in hot for the month of February. And joining us now for more from the White House is Jared Bernstein. He is chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Jared, always great to have you on the show. As we talk about progress being made in the fight against inflation, should we just be bracing ourselves for progress that is slowing or progress that could potentially reverse?
Well, if you look at most forecasts, in fact, I'm having trouble thinking of one that doesn't go in this direction. They all show that the trend is still our friend. But as Daniel was saying, sometimes that road can be a little bumpy month to month. There were potentially some anomalous factors in January and February. But even there we saw, for example, with the PPI year over year, that's a 1.6% read. Go back a year, that number was over 5%. Go back to 22, it was 10%. So over the longer term, we have a clear deceleration. And we believe that the structure is in place for that to continue. If you think about where we see the job market continuing to percolate but cooling some, where GDP continues to grow at a solid rate but cooling some, all of that seems consistent with easing pressures.
Okay, so Jared, as you talk about the idea that the road is bumpy, sure, there's also the question, though, of where the road ends. In the president's own budget that he put out on Monday, it sees CPI at an average of 2.9% in 2024. There's a difference between 2.9% and 2%. Is a 2% inflation target still realistic, or is the world just different now?
Well, this gets into Federal Reserve policy that I will assiduously avoid. We do have, I'm not exactly sure where it shows up in the budget tables, but we do have forecasts of the PCE, the Personal Consumer Expenditure Deflator, which is the one the Fed, of course, will pay more attention to. And there, if you look at the core, once again, I see forecasts, including the Fed's own, which is probably the most germane, that reinforce the comments I was making earlier on a steady glide path down to numbers that are closer to their target. Now, exactly how that proceeds and how they process that in their monetary policy transmission mechanism brain, that's up to them.
Well, as we talk about the glide path, it gets us to this kind of landing analogy, right, Jared? Right now, a lot of people say this feels very much like a soft landing, but I have to ask you if it may feel soft now because we haven't actually touched down yet. Have we really landed at all? When will we land? And how can we be so confident that landing won't be rough?
Well, I think there are two important points to respond to that. The first is that it was widely believed, and you at Bloomberg were very much part of this consensus, that we would be in a pretty deep recession about now. And I saw probabilities that were, north of 90% that would be the case. And of course, that's no longer the dominant forecast by a long shot. So to the extent that people have reset their expectations to an ongoing recovery versus a recession, I do think that's baked in the cake in a very positive way for the economy. But all of this, point two, all of this is a very, very macro, very speculative. Here at the White House, we just really have to be concerned about the kinds of pressures that families like the one this president grew up in, the middle-class working families face. Now, they've got a great job market at their back, and that's hugely important to them, but they're also still facing high costs. And therefore, our work must be to bring those costs down. And whether it's prescription drugs, whether it's health coverage, whether it's insulin, whether it's broadband, especially in rural areas, whether it is the cost of housing, childcare, all of these measures, many of which are in our budget, are efforts to significantly reduce costs. Junk fees, that's a whole other area of our work. So that's where we have to focus, helping people with lower costs today.
Well, you mentioned all those objectives that are outlined in the budget, but Mr. Chair, you know as well as I do that the budget's one thing, reality is something different. What's in the budget does not always become real in many senses. So what tools do you have left that the White House can do immediately that's not going to require congressional sign-off?
Well, I will speak to that, but let me talk about what's real in that list that I ticked off. So what's real is $35 on insulin, where seniors were paying hundreds before. What's real is after decades of other administrations trying to fight and win against Big Pharma, this president did so. So lower prescription drug costs, that's real. That's in the mix. Standing up domestic semiconductor industry, real. Standing up domestic electric vehicle industries, batteries, that's all real. Clean energy production. This is legislation that's passed. So what else can we do? Okay. Well, we're actively putting downward pressure on junk fees, as I mentioned. And one thing that's new, to get to your question, is title insurance. That's something the president talked about in the State of the Union as an area where a lot of people are paying a lot more than they should, particularly on refis, and he pulled that out and has continuously done so in his further comments about helping in the housing sector. That's something we believe we can do on our own.
Well, the president, of course, also has made a lot of comments about helping U.S. workers, specifically union workers. And so I'd like to end, Jared, thank you again for being so generous with your time this evening, on the U.S. steel deal that the president has now come out against. He essentially said it should stay in American hands, that he pledged to have the backs of steel workers, and he is following through on that, I suppose. What is the concern, though, about the economic ramifications a deal like this could have for those workers? Why does this necessarily have to potentially be a bad thing?
Well, I think that's a good question for the steelworkers themselves. The president has their back. They've certainly been outspoken about this. And I think his statement very much reflects his alignment with that group of very important American workers in a critical American industry.
All right, Jared Bernstein, chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate your time. Now, from domestic affairs to geopolitical affairs, we want to turn now back to the war in Ukraine. Earlier today, Latvian Prime Minister Vika Salina told us a Russian victory in the war will have an impact that stretches far beyond the borders of Europe. She spoke with us earlier right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Take a listen.
I am here showing my gratitude towards Ukrainian people because I believe they are fighting not just for Europeans, but for Americans as well. So that's why I see it's important that when we look to transatlantic relations, we could see those democratic values and liberties be met. That's why, for sure, I hope there will be this decision about help to Ukraine, because it's at utmost importance to my country, to Europe, to Ukrainians, that those promises and those international values we all are agreed some time ago, we can still be holding very high on our priorities.
Well, it still, though, remains very much a question whether or not Congress has that same view, whether or not continuing to provide aid for Ukraine is necessary. What is Latvia's
concern about if the aid for Ukraine does not come through to the same extent it has over the course of the war thus far. If Ukraine does not win this, what happens to your country? What do you fear would happen?
You know, our country is struggling like living in a house with an alcoholic neighbor. And I would say Russia is this alcoholic or drug addict neighbor. You never know what he will do next. So you can do your homework, you can protect your door, as Latvia has done. We're spending almost 3% of our GDP to our military and defense. We are giving Ukraine help, almost of 0.25 for military capabilities. But we know that without our allies working together, Ukraine cannot succeed in a speed we all wanting. It means that NATO countries can get under the target of Russia. So why, are we ready for that? I don't think so. Because maybe from the perspective of Washington, it seems Ukraine and Russia is far away. But if Russia wins, those consequences will affect all the world, also Washington, also United States. Not just Europe will be affected by this result of the conflict.
You're marking 20 years as a member of NATO in Latvia, which is a remarkable moment for you. And Jens Stoltenberg is asking for more. He spoke earlier to reporters, the Secretary General, asking for European nations to increase their commitment, to increase aid to Ukraine. What is Latvia prepared to do? What are your neighbors prepared to do?
We have helped Ukraine since the beginning of the war, even before. Latvians were the first who gave military aid to Ukraine, and that's why Kiev is free from Russians. And we know that we will be doing more. As I mentioned before, we are already giving 0.25% of our GDP military aid. We are leading drone coalition together with the United Kingdom, helping Ukraine to fight with Russia with drones, because it can substitute artillery in some cases. And there are many other countries joining this drone coalition. We will be the ones who will be participating in the Czech platform, buying artillery for Ukraine now, because they really need this artillery now. We cannot let Russia win this war, because it will be not just Russia, it will be China as well. So we have to understand those links are interconnected, and then we can lose the values democratic states share all around the world. We are democracies, and democracy is costly.
You mentioned that you are joining that Czech effort to get more artillery shells to Ukraine, something we know is desperately needed. Europe's promises to deliver more shells to Ukraine have not happened on the timeline at which they initially said. How else can that ammunition be sourced? What other countries might be able to provide it? How can you go about getting it to Ukraine in the more immediate term?
That's why we are joining this Czech platforms. They are ready to buy from third countries outside Europe, and we know that there will be many European countries joining this initiative. And we are looking towards India, maybe some other countries where we can find those artillery which we are not yet able to produce ourselves in Europe. The fact is that in Europe we are not able to produce so much as it is needed for Ukraine right now. That's why help from allies such as United States is very important, not just because we cannot do something that's technically not possible in such a speedy way. And I believe it is doable if we can act together, if we can act together on a united decision.
It appears likely that Vladimir Putin will win another term as president this weekend. I'm not sure how much time will be spent counting votes, Prime Minister. But do you believe that it is his goal to reconstitute the Soviet Union?
You know, it's hard to analyze what Putin thinks, because, you know, he's been a leader of that country, a neighboring country of Latvia and Baltic states, for quite a long time. And what I have seen, this country has become more desperate, less liberty, less human rights, less opportunities for freedom of speech. And I believe he has some crazy ideas in his mind if we can see what really happened with the war in Ukraine. So I can just imagine if he will have a sense that those democratic states have some crack in the wall and they are not as strong as we can act together, I believe he can use his crazy ideas and try to threaten and try to fear other countries in Europe, as well as it could be unpredictable.
That was part of our conversation with Latvian Prime Minister Vika Salina. Now, coming up, the first criminal trial of Donald Trump might not happen on March 25th as scheduled, as Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg expresses support for a 30-day delay to review thousands of new documents from the federal government. We'll have more details next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. The March 25th start date for former President Trump's trial in New York over allegations of hush money payments is now in question, after District Attorney Alvin Bragg's office says they received over 30,000 pages of new documents just yesterday from federal prosecutors, and they would support a 30-day delay. Meanwhile, Trump's team has asked for a 90-day delay. Let's turn now to our political panel. Sarah Chamberlain, Republican Main Street Partnership President and CEO, and Christy Setzer, President and founder of New Heights Communications. Thank you both so much for being here. We've talked a lot about the idea that this perhaps could be the only criminal case that actually makes it to trial before the election. If it's delayed from March, potentially, who knows how much further it could be delayed.